Welcome to the You Are Loved Ministry podcast with Pam Baggett and me, Brenda Porch. Today, we're continuing the story we began last week about two remarkable friends. And in fact, one of the friendships is one of the best friendships ever recorded in history. And it's the friendship of King David and Jonathan. Of course, I guess at the time he wasn't the king, but we call him King David, so you know who we're talking about. Um, and both of them were remarkable men. Both of them had great military strategy. They were great leaders. They were brave, and their faith earned them the trust of the soldiers. The soldiers trusted them because they were good leaders. Now, Jonathan's father was King Saul, and King Saul was not a good leader. He was anything but. He lacked everything his son had, including integrity. And we saw how Saul's disobedience led to God's decision to give his kingdom to David. So Saul was so bad that God said, I'm not keeping this kingdom in your lineage. It's going to go to somebody else. So Pam, we talked about a time when Jonathan won a major victory for Israel. Oh, I'm not supposed to say that. Okay, guys, I'm a little off my game today. All right, Pam, it's your turn.
We did talk about a time when Jonathan won a major victory for Israel, but his father took credit for the victory. Jonathan should have been a big hero that day, but while he was sneaking around Philistine territory, Saul had called for a fast for all the people, but Jonathan hadn't heard about it. So let's read about that in 1 Samuel 14, starting at 24. And the men of Israel were distressed that day, for Saul had placed the people under oath, saying, "Cursed is the man who eats any food until evening, before I have taken vengeance on my enemies." So none of the people tasted food. Now all the people of the land came to a forest, and there was honey on the ground. And when the people had come into the woods, there was the honey dripping, but no one put his hand to his mouth. But the people feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard his father charge the people with the oath. Therefore he stretched out the end of the rod that was in his hand, and dipped it in a honeycomb, and put his hand to his mouth, and his countenance brightened. Then one of the people said, "Your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, 'Cursed is the man who eats food this day.' And the people were faint." But Jonathan said, "My father has troubled the land. Look now how my countenance is brightened, because I tasted a little of this honey. How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies which they found, for now would there not have been a much greater slaughter among the Philistines?" Okay, Jonathan would have been a very different king than his father was.
Oh, yeah.
Yet because of his father's sin, Jonathan's not going to inherit the throne that would have been his. He was the oldest of Saul's sons.
That's you want to say that's not fair, but that does happen.
Mm.
Your sins do affect other people, and Saul's disobedience is going to affect his family. And that's exactly what happened. But I agree with Jonathan. If the men had been allowed to eat, they would have been much stronger. And I look at that and I say, Saul, why would you say that? To me, it almost feels like a power struggle. He's like, nobody's going to eat till I've taken vengeance. Well, Saul, you know what? It's not about you. It's not about you. It's about your men. But he never saw it that way. And when Jonathan had broken the fast and eaten some honey, that bothers me. He didn't backpedal. He didn't say, well, one little bite of honey and go kill anybody, whatever. He declared that his son should be killed, that Jonathan should die. And I love it that the people stood against Saul and said, "Nope, we're not doing that." In fact, we read that in verse 45. The people said to Saul, "Shall Jonathan die, who has accomplished this great deliverance in Israel? Certainly not. As the Lord lives, not one hair of his head shall fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day." So the people rescued Jonathan, and he did not die. I mean, good for them. I'm glad that they did, but I mean, why would he? Blows my mind. Anyway, I'm glad that they were able to stand up to this crazy king. The battles with the Philistines ended for that time. And after that, Saul continued to disobey God, which ensured that he was going to lose the kingdom. God told Samuel that he was going to have a different person made king. And Samuel was sad that Israel's first king was in this kind of position. But Saul brought it on himself, didn't he?
He's good.
God led Samuel to David, and he anointed David as a young man. So God already had another plan. Saul brought all that on himself. But as you said, I kind of feel sorry for David.
Well,
I mean, for not David, for Jonathan.
Jonathan, when you're talking about Saul's and doing it on for himself, Saul had this tendency to think that he could push a button and get God to do things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he went ahead and did a sacrifice with it. It wasn't his position to do that.
Yes.
He was always trying to do something to manipulate God. And so calling for everybody to fast,
Oh,
another one of those manipulations of God trying to get him to give them a victory.
so
But
you're thinking that God's going to have pity on the people for being so hungry and faint that he would give Saul the victory.
well, no,
Wow.
he just wanted to show God honor with you. See what I'm doing. But he's using other people to get his manipulation to work, and it doesn't work that way.
No, and God always wins. I mean,
Well,
why
I guess that's right. Saul
struggle?
didn't.
God always wins. All right,
Okay.
keep us going, girl.
Now we've got an ironic twist in the story, which brings
Okay.
David and Saul together. So let's look at 1 Samuel 16, verses 14 to 23. But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a distressing spirit from the Lord troubled him. And Saul's servants said to him, surely a distressing spirit from God is troubling you. Let our master now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is a skillful player on the harp. And it shall be that he will play it with his hand when the distressing spirit from God is upon you, and you shall be well. So Saul said to his servants, provide me now a man who can play well and bring him to me. Then one of the servants answered and said, look, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a mighty man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a handsome person, and the Lord is with him. Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, send me your son David, who is with the sheep. And Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skid of wine, and a young goat, and sent them by his son David to Saul. So David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. Then Saul said to Jesse, saying, please let David stand before me, for he has found favor in my sight. And so it was, whenever the Spirit from God was upon Saul, that David would take a harp and play it with his hand, and then Saul would become refreshed and well, and the distressing spirit would depart from him. Okay, sounds like Saul and David are getting along great, doesn't it? It is strange that Saul didn't seem to recognize David after the musical sessions began. The famous story of David defeating the giant Goliath happens in the next chapter. It may be that Saul didn't really pay attention to anything about David except the music. He noticed him after he killed the giant.
You know, I've heard research about music, and there are types of music that are very soothing. And they recommend, I know we had a teacher at school that would play, what do you call it? Mozart, Beethoven. I forgot there's a word for that kind of music, but it's not coming to my brain right now.
Classical. That's
What?
all music. Classical.
Classical. She would play classical music to her children or students, and it was really supposed to soothe them. So a harp is very relaxing and it's
Mhm.
very beautiful. But I think about David. I mean, here, one minute he's killing a bear or a lion or a giant, and he's good looking. He plays beautifully on the harp. I mean, wow. I mean, this God gave him a lot of different talents. He was
Mhm.
musically inclined, he was physically attractive, obviously it didn't go to his head, and he was a mighty man of war. And I'm impressed with that. But as far as him getting along, I'm not sure I completely agree with that. I think Saul's going to get along with anybody that gives him what he wants, when he wants it, how he wants it. And at that time, David was just a little shepherd boy that came in to play for the king. And so, yeah, I mean, they're going to get along great as long as Saul gets what he wants. But then it says in verse 18, David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly and became his armor bearer. Now, I don't really think that Saul understood or even knew what love was. Not true love. He's calling for his own son to be killed and stealing credit for his winning that war and everything. But you would think that they would be close. I mean, if he's the armor bearer, isn't that somebody that travels with you and carries your armor? You know?
Yeah, doesn't mean you have to notice them as they do it, though.
Oh,
I think it
well,
comes down because Saul doesn't always notice people. He finds what he wants, but then
I kind of think of, in my mind, it's sort of like the caddy in a golf game
yeah.
that's carrying your golf clubs. So I
Mhm.
guess it's possible that if you're all wrapped up in yourself, that you're not going to notice. But I look at those two and I think they could not be more different, David and Saul. You
Yeah,
take the character of one and you go as far as you can on the other direction, and that's where you're going to find Saul. David was a servant who humbly followed God, wanted what God wanted first. And as you said, Saul was only interested in trying to manipulate God and get what he wanted. And so I think the whole thing is interesting. Um, and then it says that Jonathan, you talked about the killing of July. Can't even talk. Not the killing of July. That's a month in the year. A killing of,
but
of Goliath. Um, then he calls for David to come to him, and I picture this stuff in my head, and I'm like, so David comes to the king carrying Goliath's head. Yeah, it ought to smell pretty good by then too.
it's
Sorry.
pretty heavy and big too. Yeah.
Yeah, and gross.
Mm.
Sorry, it's the woman in me talking. Um, but evidently, when this happened, Jonathan must have been in the room because
Yeah,
1 Samuel 18 says, 1 Samuel, I guess it's verse 18. I guess chapter 18, verse 18.
that's verse 1.
Now, when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. See, that's what I'm talking about. Saul wants what he wants. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. So, what a difference. Saul is keeping David, won't even let him go home to his own father. But Jonathan, and he claims to love him. Scripture says Saul looked at him and he loved him. Jonathan loves him, but what's he doing? He's giving him everything. The thing that's closest to him, his robe, his sword, his bow, his belt. And, I've known people men especially, that are into weapons, and they have the weapon that they use. Soldiers, if they have the weapon that they use, that's a very intimate thing for them because they've used that weapon in battle. And so for Jonathan to give those things to David, in my mind, was a real sacrifice and a real showing of just how deep their feelings for each other were. And I think it's just really neat that it's two guys that are feeling like that. So I don't know. And then they made a covenant, and covenants were very, these days, unfortunately, people say, "Oh yeah, I promise." They don't do it. But
yeah.
in those days, a covenant was a huge deal. And you didn't break a covenant.
No. But just as the friendship between Jonathan and David was beginning, things between Saul and David start to go bad, like really bad.
Yeah.
So let's look at verse 5 of the same chapter. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Now it had happened as they were coming home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine, that means Goliath, that the women had come out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him, and he said, They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day forward. Okay, now Saul is jealous and
Oh,
feeling threatened. I wonder if he's starting to think that David is the one God will give the kingdom to.
oh, he might be. He might be. But even if is not smart enough to figure that out.
Mm.
He's jealous because, but they like David more than they like me. They're saying David's done more than me, and I'm the king, and I've done more. I mean, just in my mind, I can just feel that childish attitude. Now, he probably didn't say exactly those words. I'm not trying to rewrite scripture, but we know that he was jealous. And so, at the very least, he got the message that the people had more regard for David and more respect for David than they did for him. And then what does he do? Well, he throws a spear at David, trying to kill him, not once, but twice. And David has to run away from him. And we see that in 1 Samuel 18, verses 10 through 12. And it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house. So David played music with his hand, as at other times. But there was a spear in Saul's hand, and Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped with his presence twice. Now Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but he had departed from Saul. Yikes. He's not just trying to scare David. He literally wants to pin him to the wall. You don't pin somebody to the wall without causing great harm and probably death. And so I'm thinking poor David can't win. He's
Yeah.
doing everything Saul tells him to do. When Saul sends him out, he acts rightly, he does rightly, and Saul doesn't like that. Now he's playing music. Saul doesn't like that. I don't know, Pam. What do you think?
Saul doesn't like anything that doesn't lead him to work for him. Kind of like politicians today. Some of them are crap.
That's a whole nother podcast.
Well, it is power and hungry and power. All right, so Saul tries to manipulate David to get rid of him. He's got a plan now.
Yes.
Offers David his oldest daughter, Merab, to be his wife.
Mhm.
He offers her as incentive for David to fight battles for him. But Saul is also thinking he'll put David in danger from the Philistines so
Mhm.
they can get rid of him instead of Saul and his spear. But David doesn't think he should be the son-in-law of the king. He doesn't feel honorable enough for that. That's too big a deal. So she marries someone else, but the plan is still in play. So let's look at 1 Samuel 18 and farther, verse 20. Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. So Saul said, okay, I will give her to him, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall be my son-in-law today. Well, this time Saul enlisted his servants to convince David to accept Saul's daughter as a wife. When David raised the same objection, Saul told them to offer a deal. Brenda, will you read 1 Samuel 18, 25, 27?
I will. Then Saul said, thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemy. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. Now the days had not expired. Therefore David rose and went, and he and his men killed 200 men of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them full account to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, as a wife. Sorry,
Okay,
I'm still stuck on the 200.
you look nauseous. You do.
I'm not old enough to be reading this. This needs X rating. Um, why David liked that idea, I don't know. But I play that scene out in my mind, and then I think, I'm not gonna play that scene out in my mind. What that had to have looked like. And then, first David comes to Saul with the severed head of a Philistine, and then he comes to Saul with 200 foreskins, and Saul is pleased with both of those things. I'm just not a man from that century, that's all I can say. That I don't and how Saul comes up with this stuff, I don't know, but and why Saul thought David was going to get killed. He killed Goliath. And he's a mighty warrior, and yet he thought that the Philistines were going to get David, and he knew that God was with David. Saul's just not the brightest candle in the box.
Okay, that's simple and true, yes. You part of what's bothering the nausea in your face is so funny. Um, um, if we think back, native, tribes in America would, scalp and keep the scalps or bring the scalps to show as their trophies from a battle. So, it's not a new concept or different concept, and it's
But
not
foreskins are a little private.
a little bit more, yeah, but, different cultures have had this kind of idea of how to prove that you've won a battle or done something, so, honey, just swallow it down and deal with it, okay?
Yeah, I am. We're moving right along.
Okay, it looks like Saul has a plan in place to get rid of David,
Yes.
but I'm thinking of the wisdom of Robert Burns in more modern words, and I won't use the Scottish accent. The
Oh,
best
I
laid
think you
plans
should.
No, I don't think so. The best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. Or maybe the bumper sticker type of saying that says, "Man plans and God laughs."
Oh, I love that one, and it's so true. At least it is for me. At
And
least
for
it
Saul,
is for me.
it's for Saul too, for real.
Yeah.
Everything he plans, God laughs. Yeah, really, again, no.
He just shakes his head at me all the time, I'm sure.
Oh, I know God giggles at me. I could hear him sometimes. Okay. Verse 28. Then Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was still more afraid of David. So Saul became David's enemy continually. Then the princes of the Philistines went out to war. And so it was, whenever they went out, that David behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name became highly esteemed. Okay, Saul had a right to be afraid of David.
Mhm,
Two of Saul's own children loved David.
mhm,
David keeps showing his skill in battle and his values in daily life. So even Saul's servants think highly of him.
mhm. Everybody loves David. Nobody wants to be around Saul, or at least that's how it seems to me from reading scripture. And again, I think Saul brought all of this on himself. So now, so far, we've talked about Jonathan and David's beginning of their relationship, but we have more to come. But because of time, we're going to have to stop. We're going to stop it right here. It's like, if you want to know what happens next, you have to come back next time. Tune in for the exciting conclusion of this story, because it was kind of cool, actually.
Yeah.
Um, Saul was crazy, David was wise, and God was working. But we got more stuff to share with you. So please come back. So I'm going to move on to what can we learn from these, from what we studied so far. But unless my good friend Pam has wisdom you would like to impart before I do that.
I think let's just go well.
Okay, fine. All right. One of the things that I noticed in this lesson is just because you have power doesn't make you right. And I think that is really important for all of us to know. You know, just because you're mom, just because you're the president of the company, just because you're the king, if you're not in alignment with God and you're not following him, you're going to go awry. And so Saul's story started out pretty good. I mean, the Bible tells us he was a handsome man and he was anointed to be king. And at one time, he received the Spirit of the Lord, but he became selfish and self absorbed. He stopped listening to God. And yeah, he was still king, but God was not with him. And if you don't have God with you, you're not going to be successful. He was powerful, but he used the power in a wrong way. And it reminds me of the old saying, since this is our old saying episode, complete power corrupts completely. And so he needed somebody to say, you know what, you can't do that. But I guess because he was a king, nobody could. and he used it all the wrong way. So, did you have anything you want to add to that?
I don't You're in a mood today.
I
Um,
am in a mood today.
I was thinking as we were going through the last part of it that um people think about, well, God sent the spirit so he couldn't control it, but God gave him his spirit at the beginning when he became king. And
Mhm.
he started making mistakes pretty soon after that. He made his own choices. Even if God was with him, if God's spirit was with him, he was still making stupid choices. And he was still going against God. So he didn't lose his ability to choose
Right.
what he was going to do. So thinking about the spirits, they're not in there to control or to make them do something. Saul did what Saul wanted to do, and he's responsible and accountable for what he did.
And I think a lot of our problems in life come from that. That God gave us the ability to decide. We are not marionettes. We are not puppets. We
Mhm.
have free will. And he chose to go against God and he paid the penalty for it. And, sometimes I wonder if maybe there's I don't know, an interpretation difference of how we understand, because
Sure.
as we read it, it does sound like, okay, God made him scared, or God made him worried, or God made him crazy, or whatever. But I think that's just the outcome of the choices that he made.
Right.
And he's, he, he's sitting there thinking, everybody loves David. And, like you said, maybe he's the king. We don't know. We don't know. But we do know that he was troubled and God was involved in all of it. All right. The second thing I notice is that some friendships can be unexpected. And I think we've all had someone in our life that we've become close with that on paper, it didn't look like we should match. It doesn't look like these two things should fit together. And many of you know my story. I became friends with a woman and a few years later found out that she had multiple personalities. She had over 200 of them. But even at the beginning, just to look at us from the outside, our socioeconomic standing, our physical appearances, the things that we did during the day, our standards, whatever, other than our standards for God, those matched. But everything else didn't. And in fact, her mother-in-law used to say, I don't understand why y'all are friends. And I would look at this from an earthly standpoint and say, how can Jonathan and David be friends? Because Jonathan is Saul's son and David is going to be king. And yet they were very close friends. And I think that's really, really neat. They were both fighting warriors. They were both men of integrity. But they had a very special bond, the two of them. In fact, again, we read in 1 Samuel 18:1. Now, when he finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Now, I don't know how you could get any closer than that. Um, I just wonder, we don't really know how many times Jonathan saw David in the palace or whatever when he was there playing for Saul, do we? We don't have any indication of that.
Yeah.
And so, but something evidently happened at that meeting when David's standing there with a severed head. That's when their souls became knit together. And so I just would have liked to have been a fly on the wall to know. So what did David do or say that caused such powerful emotions for these two men? I don't know. We'll never find out. I can just add that to my list of things, but I think we need to remember that don't limit God, because
Mm.
there are people out there that you can be very close to, and maybe it doesn't make sense on paper, but with God, all things can happen. So, all right. The last thing I see is a man of integrity who loves the Lord will do what is right. And we see this time and time again in David's story. Times when he had the ability to harm Saul and he didn't. Times when he had the ability to rebel against God and he didn't. Now, yes, we know the story of Bathsheba, but we also know that God called David a man after his own heart. And so I think that characteristic right there would have made me love David if I had been, with him at that time. I love him as a Bible character, but I mean, as a person, I could see why the servants loved him and the people loved him, and everybody but Saul loved him, basically. So he got a wife out of the deal, but
Mm.
he didn't do what Saul thought he was going to do, because he's a man of integrity and he was dedicated to following God. And we should be as well. I think there's so many lessons in this for us. So, well, that's all I have to say. What do you have to say, Miss Pam?
I love David and Jonathan together as friends. The whole idea of being that close just is such a blessing to think about. I have a friend that we've been friends for over 40 years and have so little in common
Mhm.
except our basic characteristics and our love for God and love for others. But other than that, we are very, very different, and yet we've always been close. I call her a heart friend
I love that.
because we don't see each other for years at a time. We still could get together and start talking and never stop, go for hours because we just are that close. And I think of David and Jonathan as being a lot like that friendship, where it's just a natural. Yep, we may not make sense together, but here we are. You know, I just want to be around this person.
I love that. I love that. And I hope everybody listening has a friend like that. And if you don't, I pray God will bless you with a friend like that, because I've heard that before, that a true friend, time doesn't matter, that you can
Mhm.
get back together after being apart for a while and it's like no time has passed. And we're going to see that kind of friendship acted out in our next podcast. It's one thing to say, oh, our souls are knit together and I love this person deeply and all that. But when you really have to make sacrifices to do what's best for that other person, that's when you know how you really feel. And so we're going to see these men do exactly that in our next podcast. So I really hope you'll come back and join us, because it's just such an amazing story. And I'm just so glad that God chose to put this in scripture, so that hundreds, thousands of years later, we can read the story of these two friends. So, all right, we'll come back next time and join us, because you never know what we're going to be talking about. And I might be in a mood next time too. You just never know with me.